Hello everyone, welcome back to RotoViz Overtime on RotoViz Radio, brought to you by Blue Wire. This is going to be a special draft edition of RotoViz Overtime. We are drafting in the $125 FFPC Best Ball Tournament. Shawn, we came in second place in this tournament last season. We're hoping to go one better. We did come second just to Conor O'Driscoll in this format. But we did that from the 112 along with Blair Andrews. And the only way, Shawn, to do it better this year is to win it all from the 112. We did a podcast that came out earlier this week talking about how to turn the 112 into a winning proposition. That's what we're tasked with here today. So the 112, how are you feeling about the draft slot and what are you thinking we should do here when it comes to the turn here at 112-201?
Yeah, I love it, right? I mean, this is a great spot. You can do so many things out of it. The players that we were looking for sort of fall to this juncture. We can take CeeDee Lamb, we can take Derrick Henry, we can take DeAndre Swift, we can go with the elite tight end and Mark Andrews. Saquon Barkley is here. Colm, we have 40 seconds. I don't know. It just seems like an abundance of riches. What direction are you leaning?
On that show earlier this week, I talked about that DeAndre Swift and Saquon Barkley should be first round picks. I'm going to put this on you, but I'm not against starting DeAndre Swift, Saquon Barkley, and then really pushing that third running back spot for quite some time here. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, let's start with Barkley and make sure that we lock him in. I took DeAndre Swift in a couple of other drafts this week and getting the exposure up pretty high there. When we're looking at this, especially in the tight end premium format of the FFPC, do you feel comfortable passing on Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts, knowing that if we do, we're going to be drafting from a lesser group of tight ends? Are you comfortable passing CeeDee Lamb here? And Derrick Henry does fall, and he's someone who, despite the lack of receptions, the range of outcomes tool still loves. I mean, he was scoring a ton of points last year before the injury. He just keeps going up and up and up.
Yeah, I'm not against taking Henry either. I would prefer to go Swift, but Henry is another player that I'm happy to go with. I think at the 3-4 turn, there is possibly an option to get Kittle or Waller, but I also wouldn't be against going the tight end. But I think it could be a pretty fun start to get the two running backs off the bat, unless you feel strongly to go tight end. 7 seconds left. Shawn can make the final call here.
Well, let's go with Derrick Henry. Just get a little bit of a different mix in there. This obviously won't be the normal RotoViz OT draft from the turn, but I don't know that we can allow Derrick Henry to go to other drafters here.
I think, Shawn, I know it's not our normal start, but I do think the way the running back position has fallen this year, we talked recently, maybe a week ago, about Derrick Henry being too much of a value, sometimes sliding to that mid-second round, and then we look at the type of profile that both Swift and Barkley have. I think the three of those guys definitely are not the usual back end of the first round running back options that we do see. So maybe it's not our normal play, but I think we're still going to be in a pretty good slot. The CeeDee Lamb was the other wide receiver I'd have been interested in there. And then you did mention both Andrews and Pitts. I think when we're drafting from the back end of the first round, obviously we'll be doing a few of these drafts. I think my thought process in that slot is that maybe in the third, fourth round, you get the option to go Kittle or Waller, depending on how those players slide out. So we will get our shots, I think, at Andrews and Pitts and other drafts. But how are you feeling after going running back to start here? I mentioned on a few shows, Shawn, I'm not against drafting running backs, and this is the most interested I've been in drafting first round running backs in quite a number of years. So how do you feel about the Henry Barkley start there?
I do like it. And one of the things that we talked about in that show is that running backs are giving you a better option this season. We mentioned Pete's note about not chasing the wide receiver points. Actually, this year, I think that Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry could easily finish 1-2 at running back. I'm not necessarily saying that they're going to finish ahead of Austin Eckler, Dalvin Cook, Najee Harris, the three guys who went ahead of us. I do like both of them ahead of Harris. But I think they easily could. I don't think that you're losing any ground at all to drafters who are picking in the middle of the first round. The middle of the first round has had very good win rates. So from that perspective, I like it. We know that the running back start has been effective historically in FFPC Best Ball contest. It's obviously not the only way to do it. I love the start that the drafter out of the 6th slot has gotten here by being able to go Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb. I think that's the ultimate dream when you're drafting out of that position. A little surprised to see Austin Eckler, Joe Mixon go together there. When you contrast those two, and when you think about where we are sort of with our running backs, I mean, I strongly prefer, obviously, Barkley, Henry to Eckler, Mixon. I do prefer the Chase Lamb start. I think that's a lot more fun. And yet, there's a lot to still happen here. I'm surprised that the Kyle Pitts hasn't gone. He should obviously be going in this part of the draft. I think that the concern about the Atlanta Falcons offense is just wildly overstated at this point. At the same time, you know, we may get like a quarter and a half into the first game of the season, and I'll be sitting there watching and thinking, well, maybe it wasn't overstated. So there's uncertainty with the Falcons. I've been playing that because I think that when you're getting opportunities like that, where the community could be wrong, that's where the big wins come in. And with Kyle Pitts, I mean, if the Falcons offense is bad, I mean, he's going to be a small loss because he's so good. The volume will have to flow through him. And the positional advantage is so great that he doesn't necessarily have to hit the heights of the players that we drafted. I mean, Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry have to be very, very good in order to justify that draft position. Due to the way all of this sets up, Pitts doesn't have to be. But Colm, we have talked about Pitts quite a bit. Obviously, listeners know where we are there. The drafter out of 3 gets to start Justin Jefferson, Kyle Pitts. Again, there are a few starts here that we probably like even better than our own. But drafting out of the 12, you've got to take some big swings, take a little bit of risk. Again, I mean, you talk about 2 years ago when Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry are going 3-4. Fantasy has evolved, but you have to look at some opportunities to sort of strike back or to zig when other people are zagging and figure out where the exploitable opportunities are going to be this season. It doesn't mean that it's going to be those 2 backs, but I do think that the value really falls off then in the second round after those guys are gone. So I like our start.
Yeah, I really like the start too. A little bit interesting, Shawn, but you have teased some of the starts for some of these rosters, and I had purposely not been sharing the draft board. So let's bring up the draft board, and anyone watching along will be able to see it, but anyone listening along will give a little bit of feedback as to how things are going. So it started off pretty much as you would expect: Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, Austin Eckler, Jamar Chase, Travis Kelce, Stephon Diggs, Dalvin Cook, Devontae Adams, Najee Harris. Then we go Barkley, Henry. So pretty much by ADP, the players you would expect to get there. The player who did slide a little bit was the one we talked about. That was CeeDee Lamb. He goes in the mid-second round, and that team in the 6th slot has started off nicely with Chase, Lamb, and Pittman there to kick things off. We also have, after our pick, Deebo Samuel, Keenan Allen going a little earlier than you may expect here. Then the Dalvin Cook drafter also got DeAndre Swift. Then Mark Andrews, Aaron Jones, CeeDee Lamb, as I mentioned, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Kyle Pitts, who we talked about, then Javonte Williams, Darren Waller, who I anticipated maybe coming back to the end of this round. That hasn't obviously happened here. Breece Hall getting a little bit of a push there in ADP. He goes to the Jonathan Taylor drafter. The team in 2 looks to be auto-drafting. They get Leonard Fournette there. Then we have Travis Etienne, Tyreek Hill, T. Higgins, Michael Pittman, James Conner. So kind of as we would expect, some players going a little bit earlier than ADP. Darren Waller and Breece Hall being 2 of the main candidates. But as you would kind of expect at this point. But as we get ready, Shawn, 4 picks away from our next 2 selections back-to-back here, who are some of the preferred options? Some of the players that will be available on the board as things stand will be Mike Evans, Nick Chubb is there, leading away from running back here, in my opinion. Then we get A.J. Brown, DJ Moore as options, Mike Williams, George Kittle, who I mentioned, Jalen Waddle, who has very suddenly become my most rostered player over at the FFPC. Who are you feeling like here? It feels like shying away from the running back options that are available. I was going to make a deal with you when we did take those players at the 1-2 turn that meant that we couldn't draft Breece Hall or Travis Etienne at the 3-4 turn. That is always the difficult part in these drafts, particularly from the back, because usually Hall and Etienne are options that may be there for you, but they are no longer there for us. How are you feeling coming into this turn? We will have a number of options that I'm very interested in, as Mike Evans and Waddle and A.J. Brown also go off the board. Yeah,
just looking at this tournament specifically in the last 3 days, we have Breece Hall at the 404. So he does go early in this draft. Players who do have ADPs sliding back around the turn: DJ Moore, Mike Williams, Cortland Sutton, George Kittle. Those are all options. I guess one of the reasons that I am looking to have a lot of Andrews and Pitts is that I do think that George Kittle, who's the player who comes back here at tight end, is a little bit of a tricky draft because Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk are so good. And so we have 30 seconds here for our pick at the 311 column. DJ Moore, I mean, I haven't been loading up so far this offseason, but he's now becoming a trendier player. I mean, he falls to us in the perfect situation. He was on that team last year, and he was actually the guy who let us down. Do we want to go back to the well? What are you thinking here?
We want to go back to the well. He's going to come true for us this year. That's the key takeaway. DJ Moore, I think, is the clear pick here in terms of the wide receiver options. It doesn't sound like you're fancying George Kittle. That kind of leaves us with the likes of Mike Evans, Cortland Sutton would be the potential remaining options with him. For me, out of those guys, Williams, I said Evans, I think I meant Mike Williams would be the option for me at this particular point. Have you a strong feeling on either of those? Now, you completely out on George Kittle at this point?
Not completely out. If that was your vote, then we'd probably have to go that direction. I think, I do like some of the late tight ends. I know that's not the way to play it. We encourage people structurally to get that elite tight end. Mike Williams here, though, is a value to me. I think he's going to be the smash player from this Chargers offense. If he stays healthy, if they take the next step, I mean, I don't see how he doesn't crush from the 401.
Yeah, let's do it. My question to you is going to be, I'm not against Kittle at that point, but based on the fact that we went running back, I do like to make sure that we start to push that wide receiver advantage as we can start those wide receivers in the flex in this format. As you mentioned, there is some later tight ends this year that maybe we wouldn't usually have the confidence in the later tight ends, and maybe that's something that'll work against us. But there's a couple of guys that we really do like that we think that if you go for a 2 to 3 tight end build in this, I think you can still make that work. So we'll see. And Shawn, the tight ends, when you do pass in this range, I have started a couple of drafts recently with the likes of, as I mentioned, Swift and Barkley, or Swift and Henry, and kind of combinations of that, starting off running back from particularly the 11th or 12th slot. But I have tried to then push that wide receiver advantage. And then I have been picking up some of those guys that we're going to target today, but also some of the tight ends and that kind of second tier when we look down to the kind of Fairmouth kind of range there. So we'll see how it's playing out. We start off now. We have 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, DJ Moore, Mike Williams, Saquon Barkley, Hunter Henry. After that, Gabe Davis goes off the board. Then we also see Marquise Brown. When I mentioned trying to push in those wide receivers, Shawn, if you start running back, are you more likely to try and focus on getting those wide receivers if there is 2 there that you like? Or let's say Waller slid back there, maybe there's no chance of Pitts getting there. But my question is, if you start off running back, are you trying to make sure you get 2 strong wide receivers after that point?
Not necessarily, because one of the reasons that the running back heavy starts tend to fail is that once drafters do go running back heavy, then they do feel that pressure to get the wide receiver. So then they lead the tight end far too late in many, many circumstances. And then as a result of that, the team just doesn't have the overall firepower. So when you start with the running backs and then you start chasing the entire rest of the draft at all of these different positions, you can make some big structural mistakes. So for me, if Darren Waller were to come back around, then I would be very interested in him. I think that in an offense that should be pass heavy, we don't know for sure that Josh McDaniels will call it that way this year. But when you have a Devontae Adams, when you have a Darren Waller, when you have an ascending veteran, and we do see some of these veterans make some big moves in their 30s. When you have an ascending veteran like a Derek Carr, then, this offense, especially when, McDaniels also has his Wes Welker, Julian Edelman type and Hunter Renfrow, right? I'm not drafting a lot of Renfrow because he just would really need to have a true Wes Welker, Julian Edelman peak type of season. I don't think that those guys, when they had the peak seasons, now, obviously Welker had some very good seasons alongside Randy Moss. But looking at how that would all work out, I don't see how Renfrow has quite the volume he needs with those other 2 guys there. He's probably not going to be the touchdown guy. And yet, if you had to make like one pick out of every player in the entire NFL for the season to just be a small win, to say this guy is going to finish ahead of ADP. We emphasize all the time that that's not how you win leagues and not how you win tournaments. But if you had to make that pick, then Hunter Renfrow would likely be there. Again, this is a situation where all of this, I believe, encourages drafters to consider Derek Carr as a discount option. I like Darren Waller. I think that number one, he's very, very good. Number two, you can see how he would have the huge game at the right time. Now, could George Kittle have the huge game at the right time? He could. The problem is that some of those other games are just so small that you're going to need to have another tight end putting up big points for you in the fantasy playoffs to get through, to have that upside in week 17. But like we talked about, there are some other guys. So from that perspective, maybe a Kittle and then a Gerald Everett, a Noah Fant, an Albert O, a Cole Kmet. I mean, it looks like Kmet could lead the tight end position in targets there. There are huge concerns about the Chicago Bears, and yet if Justin Fields and Cole Kmet are ascending players and they don't have anybody else other than Darnell Mooney, who also is a good player, another guy where, I mean, if you had to pick for a small win, I mean, Darnell Mooney is such an easy target. You look at these preseason games, his ability to get open, his ability to go up and make catches. For a smaller receiver, his athleticism and playmaking, I think, is underrated. So, I mean, Darnell Mooney is one of the guys where I'm not drafting him, and yet if that ended up being a player that I missed out on in a big way, I wouldn't be surprised. I think the Bears are going to have to do a few things there. The volume is going to run through them. You look at some of these other teams and players where the ADP is pushed up because it's going to have to run through them. I mean, Brandon Cooks, you're that excited to draft Brandon Cooks ahead of Darnell Mooney? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? So, I mean, I'm not drafting either one of those guys, but one player appears to be a pretty easy value. Now, Colm, as we go through this fourth round, we do see the normal trend that you see everywhere, which is that wide receivers are going fast and furious. One of the things I wanted to mention earlier that I did like when we started running back aside, I did like that the second round was running back heavy. I like that the beginning of the third was running back heavy. One of the things you don't necessarily want to see is for the Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey managers to make really savvy wide receiver or tight end picks in that 2-3 turn. I mean, they draft some good running backs, and maybe you say, I mean, they're going to get some wide receivers later, but I think that it's a real gift to the rest of the draft when the Taylor and McCaffrey owners add in some running back that really lowers the ceiling for their overall team. So from that perspective, I think we're in good shape. Now, the drafter out of the drafter out of 3 has started Justin Jefferson, Kyle Pitts, Travis Etienne, Jerry Jeudy, and now goes Juju Smith-Schuster. That's a dream start there.
Yeah, there's a few teams here that are going to challenge us. You mentioned, like, worst case scenario when you do go running back is that second and third round is just hammered in those yellow draft picks, and it's all wide receivers. The third round's pretty wide receiver heavy, but yeah, I think we balance that out to be able to get Moore and Williams there. Team 6 has gone 4 wide receivers to start. Team 10 has gone 4 wide receivers to start. So they are going to challenge us in terms of that wide receiver flex position. We'll see what they do over the next couple of picks here. Shawn, you did mention, the Brandon. I'm not completely against Brandon Cooks, but you mentioned Darnell Mooney. I have to say that Mooney is somebody who, in solo drafts, I've been quite heavy on. I've been hitting a lot of the super flex drafts over at the FFPC, and those teams that I've been kind of targeting my second quarterback to be Justin Fields, and I've been trying to pair him up with Mooney. And those the drafter in 6 also hits Rashad Bateman there. So some of the targets I was hoping may have slid back to us were TJ Hawkinson, Rashad Bateman. They have both gone. The other ones I'm hoping that may slide here would be DK Metcalf. I mentioned Darnell Mooney. I might have to convince Shawn to do that drafting. Around this range, they are the 2 wide receivers I tend to target. Other players that will be around there will be J.K. Dobbins or some of the elite quarterbacks that are in that range. You have also added some other players to the queue, one of those being Elijah Moore. How are you feeling at this turn? I was hoping that we may have seen Hawkinson potentially slide back to us, but I didn't feel it was realistic. How are you feeling about the likes of DK Metcalf or Darnell Mooney, who you said a minute ago that you aren't drafting very much of, making it back to us here at the turn?
Yeah, if we end up having those 2 players as our picks, I wouldn't have any problem with that at all. Metcalf, obviously a big-time playmaker, a touchdown scorer, a tournament winner, especially when you get this discount, right? His ADP, wide receiver 27. I'm confident that even with poor quarterback play, he can
Everything's
justify that slot.
Everything's priced in for him having a bad season there. There's no there's no upside being added to that price.
No, very little upside being added to that price at all. There are some other kind of fun picks who are sitting out here. As you said, J.K. Dobbins still there. He would give us that hyper fragile start with 3 in the top 5. We'd be able to really wait on running back after that if we wanted to go that route. I do think that, especially with the notes about Joe Flacco, one of the things here that just is so frustrating is you almost do feel as an Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson drafter that if Wilson is out, they might actually score more points. So from that perspective, I think we have a little bit of protection against injuries in that QB position, whereas some of the other wide receivers, if they were to have an injury, then it would knock them down. There aren't that many receivers you're going to be drafting where if the starting quarterback is out, then they go up in value. That could be the case with the Jets guys. Colm, I know you're disappointed here because Darnell Mooney does go off at the 509. Yeah,
there's no need to hide your excitement too much, Shawn. That means we don't have to draft him. I do like Mooney. I think, I'm not going to target the volume, but I also think that he's a very good player. And I think the Bears are going to be behind in a lot of games. My biggest concern after preseason is that offensive line looks very, very bad. So we'll see how that plays out. But Shawn, the team here that is up next from the 10th slot have started off Devontae Adams, Keenan Allen, Jalen Waddle, Marquise Brown. They are back on the clock. They're going to take DK Metcalf. I'm pretty sure of that, or else it'll be Chris Godwin. So we'll see how that goes here.
Patrick Mahomes.
They actually go Patrick Mahomes, so we'll settle for that. So we have one pick away. I would like to get DK Metcalf and another. DK Metcalf would be my priority pick here at this point. Then we do have to consider the potential of somebody like Lamar Jackson, and I have been drafting a little bit of Dallas Goedert recently. How do you feel about him as a tight end option, or are you trying to hold off to that tier we mentioned earlier with Komet and Fairmouth and those guys?
I'm really trying to hold off. I'm not saying that there's no way that Hawkinson and Goddard will work out. Obviously, I have quite a bit of Hawkinson. I'm basically not trying to add more of him at this point. But Goddard, again, is in that same kind of position that we have with George Kittle, to where, is he going to have some big games? I think so. He's very good. That passing offense could be crazy. Colm, we're down to 20 seconds, and Metcalf did make it through. Is that the first of the 2 picks here?
For me, it is, unless you have a reason that we don't take him in either of the 2 picks here.
No, so we will go with Metcalf. He even slides a little bit below where he normally goes. For me, the next couple of picks, Elijah Moore has an ADP that's almost around later, and there is a way to play this offense much less expensively with Garrett Wilson, but I have an absolute ton of Garrett Wilson and just an absurd exposure level. And so in this particular draft where the wide receivers have gone early, we can continue to see receivers go earlier and earlier, I would probably be okay taking him here. I think that he is actually undervalued at wide receiver 33. He's going to smash that spot. So we could go that direction.
I'm open to that. The only other player I would pitch is if you want to go elite quarterback and go Lamar Jackson, but I'm good with more either are.
We had good fortune with our elite quarterback play last year in Aaron Rodgers, but we got Rodgers at a very nice discount because of the uncertainty. One of the things that we played on that team, and one of the things that we like to do, Colm, in all of our drafts, is try to play the uncertain types of players. Now, for me, players with suspensions, players with serious injuries, that's not necessarily the kind of uncertainty that I'm looking to play, but a situation where a quarterback who almost certainly is going to play for a team and a wide receiver who almost certainly is going to play for a team, if you can get them at a little bit of a discount, especially if you're talking about guys like Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers, that worked out for us. One of the reasons that our team made it and our team won is that Aaron Rodgers and Joe Burrow put up extremely positive point numbers, especially as we got down the stretch of the season, and they weren't that expensive. Now, we talk a lot about the QB window. My highest exposures are Trey Lance, and then I have guys like Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, as some of the other main players in there. So it's not that we won't go for the expensive guys. I do have a variety of Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson teams in a situation similar to what we just had, where you don't really have anybody you like at the 5-6 turn. And the 5-6 turn is tricky, right? That's almost the position that you struggle with this year more than, say, the first and second round turn. If you have that late spot, the 5, 6, the wide receivers have often dried up. So I will go Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray there in certain instances. And that's pretty exciting, right? I mean, you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to be the highest scorer in this league at QB. I'm going to be in a situation where if my team makes it to where I've drafted it to make it, then I have that flexibility in week 16, week 17. It could be either guy. It could be a situation where in week 16, one player makes it through, in week 17, the other one does. That's the type of optionality that will allow you to have a roster that's similar to the week 16 winners, or meets the week 16 criteria, but then is different in week 17 and can really be the team that finishes up in the top 10, hopefully at the very top spot. But since we did go running back, I felt we needed the wide receivers in this draft.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I mentioned Mooney, getting more. I don't have a huge amount between those two guys, although you mentioned there is around half to 3/4 of a round of an ADP gap between those guys. The drafter who did take AJ Brown earlier is after doubling that up with Jalen Hurts in the 6th round. I was actually going to ask you that question, then you've kind of already answered it, and that is sometimes we're looking to get those 2 quarterbacks in the window, but when you are at a turn like we are here, you mentioned the example at this particular spot, but there is those spots a little bit later, whether it's like a Russell Wilson, Tom Brady, there is options to double up on those guys pretty quick. And I think having those wide receivers that we've built up now with the 4 wide receivers after the 2 running back start allows us some flexibility as we move through the draft. I think sometimes when you get into that 8-9 range, it can be a little bit of challenge if you haven't got those wide receivers to try and pivot to the quarterback position. So Shawn, so far we're looking pretty good. Team 6, I'm assuming Shawn has heard some of your content over the years as they have started out to get with a 6 wide receiver start. I'm not targeting Thielen or Robinson, but he has really laid in with Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Pittman, Robinson, Rashad Bateman, and Adam Thielen. How long do you think both him and that drafter out of the 10th slot who has a quarterback and 5 receivers are going to hold that to us? I would have preferred if they were a little bit more running back heavy through those opening 6 rounds.
Yeah, this is something where it's probably bad for them and bad for us, right? Both because we don't want the wide receivers to dry up in a league that we're playing in because we need to have that to have the overall tournament winning upside. And yet at the same time, it's probably not the way to play a best ball league. We talk about what are the differences in 0 RB between best ball and redraft. In redraft, this is a very viable way to approach it. You want to get the 6 of the top 15 overall guys. You can wait until the double-digit rounds to select your first running back. In best ball, because you can't swap out players, and because the positional requirements are so specific and the overall final build really needs to hit certain numbers, then you don't have quite that flexibility. I was just looking it up to see how that had performed in this tournament the last couple of years. Obviously, it's an unusual start, right? Only 23 times actually. 0% wins. It comes in with about an average score. There are no elite scores from that group. If we take it down and look at, say, taking 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds, that still is something that hasn't been super effective. Only a 6.3 win rate. Again, not great top 2 percentile outcomes. So it probably doesn't work for him. And it's a situation where when you have that elite upside in players like Chase, Lamb, Pittman, Bateman, I mean, how do Robinson and Thielen really fit into that? Now, a lot of people are very enthusiastic about Robinson. I think it probably made more sense to be enthusiastic when we didn't have kind of these nagging concerns about Matthew Stafford. But maybe that's really all just sort of smoke and mirrors or just not a big deal. Robinson, Thielen, guys who could score a bunch of touchdowns. We know that touchdowns are going to be very relevant in an optimized scoring format, in a tournament format. Maybe that'll work out for him. It certainly is not ideal for the drafters here in the top 4 slots, where through 6 rounds, only one team that had a top 4 slot has more than 2 wide receivers. So these 2 extremely wide receiver heavy squads are hammering them hopefully we'll be in a position to sort of thread the needle, come out and benefit on both sides of this. I am glad that we did go with those 4 wide receivers as opposed to taking a risk at tight end, taking a little bit of a luxury pick at QB. I was hoping that Drake London might fall a little bit further. Probably didn't have a realistic chance to get back to us, especially with this being a wide receiver heavy draft. His ADP in the last couple of days, still on a high volume of total drafts, is there at 705. So he's sort of a mid 7 pick. He does go to the turn drafter there at 701. I like that selection. I guess I've already made a pitch for the Falcons. Kadarius Toney at the 704, Amari Cooper 702. Colm, one of the articles released just a couple days ago talks about Amari Cooper and how you can get his upside, if there is any upside, you can get his value, right? I mean, he's a value play where you're trying to get cheap targets. And with Cooper specifically, you're trying to benefit from those cheap targets at the end of the season. I do think that unless you have a very specific type of build, then having Cooper early is going to hurt you a lot. But an article on how to get those cheap targets at a discount. And I think that if you're targeting that type of profile, that's not necessarily a league winning profile. It's more of a get us across type of profile. You want to do it inexpensively, but then again, you want to get any profile that you're targeting as inexpensively as you can. That's one reason why we have been targeting Wilson instead of Elijah Moore. You want to get that exposure to a specific offense and to a high talent level at a discount. Now, whether or not that'll actually be a discount. I mean, Elijah Moore was fantastic last season. I was just noting in an article that will come out today that he had the second most points contributed to starting lineups among receivers drafted outside the top 100 last season. And that's despite only playing in 50% of the snaps in 8 games. And he was the guy we were desperately hoping would be available for week 17 last year and was not. So, and then he's been supposedly the biggest standout of Jets training camp. So if you're talking about a rookie versus a second-year receiver who's ready to ascend and be a star, you're not necessarily getting a discount. I mean, that's why the ADP is different. Colm.
Yeah, that was the killer, Shawn. As people hear that growing, that's Trey Lance going off the board. He was the hope here to come back, and we'll see if Ayuk makes it, but there was an opportunity to potentially go Ayuk and Lance. But we'll talk about that in a second, Shawn, but that is a heartbreaking pick. When we look through the players that have gone since us, it's Dallas Goedert, Chris Godwin, Cam Akers, Jalen Hurts. There has been a quarterback run over the last 2 rounds. We have David Montgomery, Adam Thielen, Josh Jacobs, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Zach Ertz, Alan Lazard, Drake London, Amari Cooper, Tony Pollard, Kadarius Toney, Joe Burrow, Chase Edmonds, Russell Wilson, Elijah Mitchell, and Trey Lance. I was hoping, Shawn, that was the pick that we got here at the back end of this round, and I can tell you already mentioned earlier that he was your most rostered quarterback, but he does go there a couple of picks before us, which is hugely disappointing. Any other players that are primed here? Miles Sanders goes off the board. Antonio Gibson is top of the board by ADP. I'm hoping that he goes off the board here before it gets to us, but we will have back-to-back picks. I like both Devontae Smith and Brandon Ayuk as options here. There is the quarterbacks and Tom Brady and Dak Prescott as potential options. We do have our 2 top-tier running backs, and one of those guys who, if we didn't have those, would have been an interest was Ramondre Stevenson. How are you feeling like playing as we are back on the clock, Shawn? 46 seconds to make a selection here.
Yeah, well, the top receiver by ADP is Hunter Renfrow, and we did make a pitch for him as being a little bit undervalued. I do think that the potential league winners are probably Devontae Smith and Brandon Ayuk. It would be hard, I think, to go away from either player, especially when we did have that Henry Barkley start that gives us, these 2 potential legendary running backs to begin with.
Yeah, I think this pushes us into getting those 2 guys, and it probably turns into a potential 3 quarterback build. But I'm willing to push quarterback to the next 2 rounds and see who maybe lasts to us. If you want to go the way of Ayuk and Smith, that would be my preferred options.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you, if you were comfortable waiting at QB.
I just think those 2 guys are, like, when we're looking at some of the profiles of these players, there's lots of, if it was Renfrow we were picking here, I'm happy to go quarterback. But when we have the option for Ayuk and Smith, I think that's the way to go for the upside plays.
I do as well. The first thing we have to do is win this league, right? And the kind of extreme builds that we're getting on both sides with some running back heavy and some wide receiver heavy, we have this path sort of in between them. And even though the vast majority of my teams are 2 QBs in the window, I don't think that you want to get so caught up in it that you don't sort of show the flexibility in a given draft. I think that Tom Brady is a value here. I think that he probably is the right play here. And yet that one doesn't get me fired up to, root for this team all season in the way that waiting for a Derek Carr or a Justin Fields, a Daniel Jones, a Jared Goff, a Marcus Mariota,
a Baker Mayfield.
Colm, how did Baker Mayfield get into the conversation there?
I don't know. We have DJ Moore. we could hold out for Geno Smith as well. I think
the last thing we need is another Week 17 where we have any sort of Baker Mayfield incentive and he's throwing the ball into the backs of his offensive linemen again.
We are running this back a little bit though, Shawn. We mentioned DJ Moore. We also have Elijah Moore, who you mentioned. So, we might want to get some of that Baker Mayfield, Jarvis Landry exposure just to break our hearts again.
Memories. Colm, in terms of looking at this team now and this running back and wide receiver heavy start, obviously one of the things that we talk a lot about on the shows, that we write a lot about in the Best Ball workshops on the site, are the importance of actually executing the onesie positions, getting your tight ends, getting your quarterbacks, not getting so locked in on, I need to keep up with the Joneses on running back and receiver depth, and ignoring these positions that do dictate winning your lead. They put you in position to win tournaments. How do you feel about the flexibility to occasionally go away from that? Again, it's going to depend how much individual listeners are drafting. If you're going to draft 5 times, you're going to have a little bit different approach than if you're drafting 10, which is going to be a little bit different than if you're drafting 50, which is going to be a little bit different than if you're drafting 150. And so, from that perspective, you have to select an approach that works for what your overall volume is going to be on the season. But given that the vast majority of my teams are executing those, I do like to go away from it when I think it makes sense, in part because you don't ever want to get so locked in that you start making bad decisions on the clock just to try and force the structure. And in some cases, maybe diversifying into players that you don't actually want in your portfolio. But the other part then is, yes, these things historically have been very successful. Yes, there's a logic behind that. It's not just saying, this worked before, it'll probably work again. There are reasons why it works. And yet we know that specifically at the onesie positions especially, we're talking about a handful of players, right? And so if you do have a late round quarterback who comes through with a big season, if you do have some late round tight ends who come through with big seasons in a particular year, then that's going to have an outsized impact on how that entire campaign plays out. And I don't know that you want to have zero exposure to some of those types of eventualities, especially having zero exposure when the team and the league kind of dictated that you had a good opportunity to get the exposure in that instance.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said there. In terms of the way this roster is played out after 8 rounds, I'm very pleased with where we're sitting. We'll see how that plays out now through the next 12 rounds. But something that I wanted to hit on also when you mentioned about the tight end position, like we did discuss Colm earlier. Colm has gone off the board in the early 8th round. He normally goes kind of mid-9th round. We have some players in this draft who have taken players, as we mentioned, the team at the 101 has taken a couple of players quite a bit before ADP, and Darren Waller, Breece Hall also took Drake London a couple of picks before ADP. What we're seeing here is Colm has gone off the board about a round before normal. Dawson Knox goes a little bit earlier. Zach Ertz actually goes off the board a full round earlier than normal. So there's a couple of players here who have kind of switched up that tight end ADP. And I think sometimes if people are really pushing the ADP, the part that some drafters might get sucked into is, I've got to go and get my tight end now before they're all gone. And then they pass up somebody like, let's say, Devontae Smith or Brandon Ayuk to make sure they get a tight end that isn't off the same equivalent value. So my thing is trying to stick to the goals that we talk about in all our shows. But when it's a case that the draft falls in a certain way, to be able to kind of have that flexibility. And I think how we've set this up is going to give us some flexibility for when we need to make those decisions a little bit later. Both Tom Brady and Dak Prescott go off the board in back-to-back picks at the end, towards the end of the 8th round here. But I do think what you said there about not being overly locked into that exact time to get the player and really pushing it. Like if you take, let's say you take Kirk Cousins in the quarterback window just to force to have a quarterback in the quarterback window, it's kind of going against the whole entire premise of it. So I think it's important to do it when the timing's right and how the board falls. But there's certain teams here who we've talked about some of the players they've taken that we aren't targeting or we aren't trying to get in and draft. I've been quite harsh on Adam Thielen this offseason. He's a mid-6th round pick. We take Brandon Ayuk and Devontae Smith after him and both those. I would rather take those guys in his draft slot straight up, and we get them quite a bit considerably later. So there's certain things that people are doing that I don't think work in this. But that drafter that I'm saying about Adam Thielen has actually ran up that wide receiver start that he has with Chase Edmonds and Kareem Hunt. So things may start to look quite bright for that drafter as we move forward here. Shawn, some teams in this draft are really putting themselves, as we talk about the structure of our roster, into very challenging spots. For example, drafter out of 7 starts Travis Kelce, Aaron Jones, James Conner, then takes Terry McLaurin, then goes back to A.J. Dillon, David Montgomery, Russell Wilson, Antonio Gibson. So they have started this draft with a tight end, a quarterback, 1 wide receiver, and 5 running backs. You can start 4 running backs actually in this format. But there's certain teams in here who, although we haven't got our elite quarterback we maybe wanted specifically to get, and we may not have our elite tight end, I think in this particular room, we are gaining advantages through what other players are also doing, as well as hopefully setting ourselves up for success with what we've done so far.
I think that's exactly right. You do point out that you can start 4 running backs in this format. If you draft specifically to do that, then the win rates end up not being particularly strong. All you have to do is pull up the Blair Andrews Win the Flex, and you'll see how that doesn't really work from a positional scoring perspective. Now, again, any individual season, you're going to see some strange results. If you hit on all the right guys, then you have the potential with a fun lineup. That team also does start with Travis Kelce, so they're in all likelihood going to get some elite tight end scoring. One of the great things about fantasy is that within any given league in any given year, you never know how things are going to pan out. It is too bad to see Pat Freiermuth go off the board there in the middle of the 9th round. He is an interesting tight end selection. His ADP in the last couple of days is at 9-11, as drafters are souring a little bit on the Steelers offense, but also very enthusiastic about George Pickens and his potential to be the league winner there if both Deontay Johnson and George Pickens demand a lot of target volume. Then the question is how much will be left over. But I do tend to think that a functional offense benefits the tight ends who you want to be effective in the red zone, and guys who are down by the red zone frequently. I think Pickens could actually help Freiermuth. Obviously, he crushes Chase Claypool. We're 3 picks away. Matthew Stafford still there. Again, has the elbow concerns. Derek Carr still there. Aaron Rodgers still there. I was going to ask you if, we had kind of the fun episode where I was giving Aaron Rodgers a hard time, but, Romeo Doubs, Colm, I mean, again, just in this preseason game, a touchdown, getting open at will. If he pushes his way into that starting lineup along with an Allen Lazard, I don't know. Are you thinking that Aaron Rodgers now starts to become draftable? His ADP 1003. So looking here at the end of 9, Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, Aaron Rodgers, those are the guys you would be looking at that turn. The next turn features Justin Fields and Trevor Lawrence. Some high-end outcomes possible there, but definitely a lot different in terms of what you're looking at for the floor.
Yeah, I think he is draftable, but my concern is still not going to be the players that the Packers have on offense. I think the Packers defense is going to just crush teams this year. I don't think they're going to need to put up points, and I think that's going to encourage the slow pace of play. But when we get into a situation where we're really pushing into the 9-10 turn here, I do think he's very much draftable there. If you're asking me who would I rather draft, him or Stafford, I'm probably leaning towards him. Derek Carr does go off the board, then James Cook. We are on the clock. We have 56 seconds. I'm willing to kind of probably go to the next turn and see if we get 2 infields in that kind of range. But if you want to take a quarterback here, I'm good with that as well. The probably the top picks for me would be Traylon Burks and Rashad Penny, but we've really loaded up on those wide receiver positions. So if you want to pivot, some tight end options, but nothing that's getting me hugely overexcited. Although our favorite in Alberto is there. Still concerns around some of the reports over recent weeks.
Yeah, I don't know. This Penny here feels like a must draft.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say he feels like the player that I think we have to take, and then I was thinking the other kind of secondary option would be a quarterback, or else potentially Aaron Rodgers, or else we could pivot into the tight end position.
Yeah, do you have a preference? I mean, Stafford, if he plays, is kind of hard to, and I say if he plays, I mean, he's going to play, but if he's limited, I don't know. I might be all the way around to Rodgers here. I think the efficiency is going to be there again. Obviously, he was a strong play for us a season ago. You know, he has Devontae Adams, and one of the things we liked there was that it was with Devontae Adams. We could very easily, in all likelihood, will end up without any of his pass catchers in this draft if we select him. Call him Alberto or Aaron Rodgers here.
Let's go with Rodgers. The reason for that pick is that I want us to win, so Shawn has to declare his undying love for Aaron Rodgers at the end of the season.
There we go.
That was it. I'm not sold on the Rodgers. The other thing I'm thinking is there is some later potential options that we could pair in, and we have waited on tight end to this point. There is obviously, tight end, once you get past those elite guys, a lot of it is going to be related to touchdown production. You could potentially at a later stage pair him up with the likes of Robert Tonyan to try and get some stacking action in this build a little bit later. I'm still drafting Albert Okubun in certain drafts, but I really like trying to get 2 to 3 tight end builds, and then also putting one of the rookie tight ends in there at the end of it, both of them in certain drafts. But that's making me kind of pass over Alberto for the price discount you're getting on Greg Dulcich at this particular point. So we'll see. Alberto feels like a player who in certain drafts is going to slide considerably, and he is somebody who could potentially sneak back around to us. I don't know that he will. We have quite a few teams in this draft already that have 2 tight ends on their roster. I was hoping Justin Fields was going to come back to us in the next round. So that obviously doesn't happen. He goes off the board 3 picks after us. Zach Kruger's guy, Brian Robinson, goes 1 pick after us at the 10:02. We also seen Isaiah Pacheco go off the board in the mid-9th round. So those rookie running backs are getting hyped up quite strong. We have the Robert Woods draft. We're also taking Traylon Burks on his team. Shawn, I just wasn't sold on any singular pick there. That is kind of a range where when you are on the board, if you have started off without those elite running backs that we have, a Penny and a second option like the likes of a Kenneth Gainwell or a Brian Robinson are very exciting to pair together there. How are you feeling about that Aaron Rodgers pick at this particular point? I think in the range that he's going at, I think that's a fair value for him, even with the concerns I have. I think there's going to be still some spike weeks in there.
Yeah, they're going to be spike weeks. And the one thing I wanted to avoid if we had good options, and we obviously did have good options, was to go completely outside the QB window for even our QB1. So we didn't want to get into that position. We do have some guys who could theoretically come back around in Garrett Wilson and Romeo Doubs on the wide receiver position. I mean, the guy that I actually was the most interested there was Rondell Moore. He does go, I believe, here at the 209. That's a good selection. I think that he is going to have a big season, but I do have quite a bit of more exposure. That would have been ahead of ADP. When you're looking at those rookies potentially wrapping back to us, I think taking the QB there made sense. It's also a situation where even though those rookie wide receivers may wrap back around and George Pickens goes at the 10-10, we're going to have to address tight end as well. And so there does become a point where you have to get your QBs and your tight ends going.
Or you could just get Noah Fant and Gerald Everett and be done with it.
Well, that's kind of our plan. But even if we,
that is our plan
even if that's the plan, then you still have to. position yourself to make some of those selections, right? I mean, sometimes you can think, okay, well, I have this target in round 11, this target in round 12, this target in round 13. I have some flexibility here. There are some receivers I like. And then you get to those picks and you realize, oh, I mean, I do like the guys here, but I can only take one, right? I don't have 12th round picks. I don't have 13th round picks. And so making sure that you've kind of mapped out what those positions have to be. Sometimes you can get in a situation where you are here a little bit where you get those 2 running backs to start in Barkley and Henry, and you're thinking, man, we're flying. This is great. As long as we don't get completely wiped out at wide receiver, then we're going to be golden. Then you get a stretch where you take DJ Moore, Mike Williams, DK Metcalf, Elijah Moore, Brandon Ayuk, Devontae Smith, and you're thinking, okay, we've got this draft won, right? We have the flexibility and we have the upside at those positions. And then there are plenty of players that you like in rounds 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And you can forget that, I mean, you may like guys there, but the whole build still has to work together. So when you said Aaron Rodgers, I was glad to hear that. I think that puts us in a perfect position to finish out this roster the way that I like. Now, there are some guys in Jared Goff specifically who I think you could flip him out for Kirk Cousins and say that's going to be the same scoring outcome. Kirk Cousins goes in the middle of 10. And I'm not saying that Kirk Cousins is a bad pick. I mean, when you have Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, then not only is your overall season looking very solid, but in an individual game, you could, I mean, Kirk Cousins is not good, right? So he's probably not going to pull off that week 17 Jared Goff game that we saw last year. I mean, he's probably not going to have too many of those. But again, you have Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. The sky is the limit. So I'm not criticizing that pick, but I think with Jared Goff and the way that he's looked early on here, that Patrick Mahomes impression in his drive here in preseason, Patrick Mahomes, I believe, has played 3 drives, has led 3 scores, has looked infallible and unstoppable. He should be the QB1, right?
Yeah, let's see if he makes it back to us. The way this draft's going, we're not quite sure. What are some of our favorite options here that you've lined up in the queue for us?
Well, Jared Everett and Noah Fant both have round 12 ADPs. So with the 11-12 turn, if we wanted to hit both of them, we would probably have to do it. One of the frustrating things, but something that happens in these drafts, you just have to kind of deal with it and move on. And the 2 guys that we were interested in as potential fallers, Matthew Stafford and Albert O, they both appear to have been autoed, although perhaps that drafter had set his queue up and did get the guys that he or she wanted there. But that's unfortunate if there was a potential for either of them to really crash all the way through the 11th round. The other play here, Colm, that starts to get pretty interesting, now that we've taken Aaron Rodgers.
Is it the Packers wide receiver 1?
Wow, the Packers wide receiver 1. I mean, Romeo is there with 2 picks to go. We also have Jahan Dotson here. And I mean, we definitely do not need 2 wide receivers, but both of those guys look, I mean, they're the 2 best values on the board. And so just from a fun perspective, I have a hard time passing on the 2 of them. I mean, McCole Hardman goes, and
these things happen.
I probably just don't understand how McCole Hardman is going to score all of his points. But
those are the picks, Shawn, that you're hoping that happen when it's coming to you in the queue.
Yeah, I mean, so you could easily be wrong, but as long as players you're not going to draft anyway go ahead of you, it pushes your own targets down. Colin, we've arrived at a tricky point here. What are you hearing about Robert Tonyan? Is he a viable tight end option? Because if you're ever going to draft Robert Tonyan, it would make sense to do it on this roster, I think. Not at this point, but in terms of kind of preparing for what's going to happen later.
Yeah, so before we have 2 options. We either go double tight end or we go wide receiver and tight end. I think there is a slim possibility that Dubes may get back to us in the next round, but if we want to lock him up, we can do that. The reports are that he's going to be healthy for the season and that he will be the tight end 1. So again, it'll be touchdown dependent, but I think we take 1 tight end here and then we discuss what we want to do with that second pick.
Okay, so we have selected Gerald Everett. That gives us quite a bit of exposure to that explosive Los Angeles Chargers passing offense that has the Rams in a potential shootout in week 17. Colm, I think that Fant has a much better chance of coming back to us than Dobbs does.
Let's do it.
But
I'm going to talk me around it. I think when you make the Aaron Rodgers play, we want to make some stacks with our quarterback. So I think that makes sense. We are taking that probably half a round to a round ahead of current ADP. That is at the 12:01. Shawn will have it pulled. I usually pulled up for the last week. Shawn will have it for the last 3 days, but he has been usually going in that early. Let me get it here. No,
I'm seeing 12:06. I'm 12:06. Not going to come back around.
Yeah, you are actually correct. I'm seeing 12:06 as well. Wide receiver 55. So, yeah, I think that's the smart play. I think that we have flexibility. The hope is that the tight end falls back to us, but if he doesn't come back, then we do have some fallback options. I just love the 2 rookie tight ends, and I'm starting to draft Bellinger a little bit as well, the 3rd rookie tight end from the Giants. Both Dulcich and Trey McBride have been 2 of my favorite targets to draft. I feel like, particularly if you get into that area of the draft and you're like, there's not a huge amount of other options, the upside of those 2 guys is massive. But if you're drafting, a 3 tight end build, I think it's just the upside is immense. So we will have fallback options where I don't think we'll have as many fallback options on pairing people with Aaron Rodgers, because if you're reading between the lines on the podcast and you hear Shawn talking about the Packers, he doesn't want to draft Randall Cobb. He doesn't want to draft Sammy Watkins. So it feels like I can hype up Robert Tonyan to some point, maybe to get him to draft him, but it felt like that was a major point there to potentially get the stack. So we're starting to round out here, Shawn, into fine form. I'm going to set the chances of Noah Fant coming back to us at 8.5%. Are you more optimistic than that?
I am. He's getting what you might call negative buzz there with how he's looked and how the offense has looked in these preseason games. I think that's fantastic, because if a player is very well established, and you can argue maybe that Noah Fant isn't, but one of the things that I like to mention when we're in these tight end premium formats especially is that you pull up the stealing signals tool and you will see that guys like Fant and even Gerald Everett, especially Everett down the stretch of last season, have a route profile and targets, within that put them much higher than where they're drafted. And so you're getting this extreme discount for Fant. With Everett, you're getting the discount because his track record is poor, right? With Fant, you're getting this discount because the offense is expected to be absolutely terrible. Now, one of the things that you and I are always joking about is that we do have maybe too much exposure. We're overweight on this Week 17 Jets Seahawks game, but in part we're overweight because those teams are discounted because their offenses are expected to be bad. And that's a situation where, that's how you're going to win and win big in years. Now, I'm not saying that's actually going to be how this season plays out.
Shawn, we didn't mention it at the time, but we've got DK Metcalf and Penny. We may get Fant, and we also have Elijah Moore. So we're stacking that up again. That's no longer a joke, Shawn. We are overexposed to that. Yeah.
Well, it can be true and a joke, right? So we have that situation going. In the seasons and on the teams where the community ends up being wrong on those teams, then again, that's how you end up with a bunch of teams at the top of the leaderboard. It's definitely fine with me. One of the things that Michael Dudmer talks about in the Best Ball Bible, and again, if you haven't read that, it will take you from novice to superstar as a best ball drafter within the course of reading it, right? It's going to take a few minutes. It's this epic article. It will get you there. If you're listening to us and you're like, it doesn't seem like Shawn and Colm know what they're talking about. I want to go somewhere else for information. Go to the Best Ball Bible. It will get you set. You'll be absolutely awesome. You'll be glad that you did. If you're someone who's had a lot of success in best ball in the past, and you're thinking, what are these tiny little edges that can take me to winning the tournaments, that can make me this is a $200,000 grand prize this year. Is that right, Colm?
$200,000 for first place. Yeah.
Excellent.
So people can try and get second place, because obviously we're taking first place here today.
First place with our Jets Seahawks team. We'll see how that goes. Noah Fant still on the board here as we get to the end of round 12, as is Robert Tonyan, as is Jared Goff.
And I haven't mentioned this, somebody who I've seen just tumble in drafts, and I think it's going to continue with the reports that have come out over the last couple of days, and that is Mike Gesicki, tight end of the Miami Dolphins. I don't know how his ADP continues to show up on the tools as high as it is. Obviously, some people must be taking him vastly ahead of draft order, but he continues to slide. Somebody who I've liked in the past, but it seems like they are not going to be using him quite in that George Kittle role like some people may have hoped earlier this offseason with how they're installing that offense. He seems to be in blocking a lot more, but we'll see how that plays out. But he is somebody who's sliding quite a bit. Since we passed on Fant, who was our target, though. So Irv Smith has gone, Hunter Henry has gone, Evan Ingram has gone. As I mentioned, tight ends by ADP. Then we have Mike Gesicki. Then it will be Tyler Higbee. Then it is Noah Fant, David Njoku. And then we're getting into Robert Tonyan territory. So, Shawn, we should get one of those two tight ends and Fant or Tonyan back to us. Do you think we get one tight end if we can here on this return back to us? And then have you any other options? We're in that range where we're not all that far off the ADP of Jared Goff. Mac Jones goes in that kind of range. Any other players that are striking your fancy here? Daniel Jones goes in this range as well. You're on mute. Sorry, Shawn.
We talked about that Chargers-Rams game, and one of the things that I really do strongly emphasize is don't overemphasize some of those things to where you take lesser players as you're going through your drafts. But if you need a position, right now we need tight end. Tyler Higbee is there. He is not particularly popular this year, and I think that makes sense. I don't think that he should be popular, but as we look for ways to play this, he has a mid to late 12th ADP. He's someone who, if he fell through, we could look at in terms of that Packers-Vikings game at this point. KJ Osborne probably really the last true shot for a Vikings player. He's not an option here at the 13-14 term, but someone to keep in mind for later if we want. Just to give a sense of where he is going in drafts, his ADP is 1502. Colm, we're now 4 picks away. Fant, Tonyan, Higbee, all still there at tight end. What are you thinking here?
Well, I'm still to the point. We're definitely taking one. My priority here is Fant. The question I have to bounce back to you is, do you think that we should look to see if we get is there any possibility you want to go with 2 tight ends there? You made a compelling case for a couple of those guys, but I do think that a second quarterback is also something that we have to seriously consider here. The quarterbacks left at this particular time are Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Mac Jones, Ryan Tannehill, Davis Mills. Then you're into Carson Wentz, Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, who I mentioned earlier, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but Zach Wilson is also somebody who his ADP is going to dip a little bit here as he potentially misses the start of the season. But out of that list that I mentioned, Shawn, who are the realistic targets that you want to have on this roster?
Well, I think Mac Jones and Jared Goff, very clear possible options, guys I would be very comfortable with. Based on how this draft is going, I would be okay to go Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder in the 19-20. I think that situation there is going to score points. The reason we mention that is that Jared Goff has an ADP in between our 14th and 15th round picks. He probably doesn't come back. And I am vaguely interested in taking a couple of tight ends here. You do get to a point where Gesicki, even if he's not as involved in the offense as people were hoping, it just is a little bit silly that he's still available. One of the things that we're looking at is that there are really 4 tight ends that we could take. None of them will come back if we pass. And so that's the issue. If you have 4 good options, I don't know. We could let one of them drop here, Colm, and with there being so many, it increases your chances. But again, I mean, there's going to be that secondary tight end run that wipes the rest of them out. So
I think the one we really want to get is Fant. Is that your first preference at tight end?
Yeah, so let's take Noah Fant here.
And that's nice because he was somebody we talked about potentially taking over Doob to. Now we have both of those guys. Gesicki, who I mentioned earlier, has fallen quite considerably here. Usually goes about 2 rounds before this, so he would be an option. I'm on board with going. I mentioned my love for the rookie tight ends earlier, but I'm willing to get a third veteran here, and then because obviously if we're looking at those potential options, you mentioned a quarterback later in the draft, that's going to take us out of the running for some of those guys. So I think we should go here for that second tight end and see who comes back to us then between maybe Goff or Mac Jones if we're lucky. Gesicki has fallen in terms of ADP, but does that mean that we should be taking him here, or should we go and make the Tonyan play?
I'll leave it up to you. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I think we should go Tonyan just for the stack. I don't know. I drafted Gesicki quite a bit earlier in the offseason, and obviously it's hard sometimes for players you draft early who continue to fall. CC Ronald Jones, who I've continued to draft over the past week. But I'm just not sold on the role that Gesicki is going to have in this offense the more we read about it, and I have legitimate concerns. So he is it was hard to pass him up, but I just think for this build we should be going with Tonyan. If I hadn't said Tonyan, would you have preferred Gesicki there?
I probably would have. I think that the upside is still pretty significant. But one of the things that when we're drafting together is we want to be aware of and respectful of the exposures that our co-manager has. And so from that perspective, I'm certainly fine missing on him. I am not a believer in Randall Cobb and Sammy Watkins. So if there's a potential that those guys are going to be the players who are heavily featured as receivers in this offense, then I think playing the pivot to Tonyan makes a lot of sense. He's probably not going to be the volume guy that we need to win the tournament overall, but having the occasional spike weeks, the touchdowns, he could wildly outperform from a touchdown percentage perspective. I think
the other thing in this format is that you can, if you have 2 tight ends who really go off in a week, you can start 2 tight ends in this format as well.
That's a very good point. And so in those weeks where he does score touchdowns during the regular season, he helps us out from the perspective of our flex and just, making sure you make it through. One of the things that can just be so tempting is to draft exclusively for the playoff weeks and forget that you have to build as many rosters as possible. I mean, Colm, we're not going to end up with just 1 or 2 teams like we had last year. I mean, last year we had 2 teams together. One of them went through. But we're also not going to have 50 teams in this tournament. We're likely to have somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe closer to 5. And so, I mean, you want those 5 teams to make it through. And from that perspective, I like where we're going with this. I like the balance that the team has now. I think the decision to wait on tight end earlier really paid off with how these tight ends have made it to us at this spot. And interestingly enough, Brevin Jordan, Hayden Hurst, 2 guys we weren't considering, are the next 2 tight ends to go.
Yeah, Brevin Jordan continued. We had a couple of weeks where Brevin Jordan was a kind of ongoing joke on the show that Shawn wouldn't let me draft him, but I think people have realized at this point that was just for entertainment purposes as we've continued to not draft him at this point. The interesting part is, Shawn, if I had told you when we were drafting those wide receivers, I mentioned the possibility of taking George Kittle, who we did pass on, tight ends. Everett and Fant is the players that I kind of joked about as being those players that we wanted to get later. If in an ideal world, they're the guys we get, and that worked out perfectly for us. The other question I had for you, Shawn, with the Tonyan side of things, was he has obviously the same bye as Aaron Rodgers. That's not going to surprise him. It's a week 14 bye. But when we look at the other tight ends that we have, we took Everett week 8 bye, Noah Fant week 11 bye. I'm not looking to say I don't want to have 2 of my 3 tight ends have the same bye, but I think in leagues where you can have the option to not have them, I do use it as a tiebreaker because, as I mentioned, you can start 2 of them. If one of these guys gets injured, you want to keep those options open as well. Is that something that you would look at all at the tight end position when you're drafting these rosters, the bye weeks and the flexibility of that, or would you just have taken Gesicki and not worried about that?
Well, I think if you're having a hard time deciding, you definitely want to use it as a tiebreaker, because if you're going to have 3 tight ends, one of the advantages you do want is to have 2 of them available in any given week. If you draft 2 tight ends with the same bye and the other tight end is hurt, then, and one of the things that we know, our roster last season it wasn't among the luckiest rosters. We did have some players hurt, and the fact that Elijah Moore wasn't available at the end, that was frustrating. But clearly it was among the better results in terms of how many players stayed healthy. I mean, you're going to need your roster to stay healthy if you're going to be in consideration for that final group. So you have to get lucky. But then within that context, even then, you're still going to have some injuries. If you have an injury to a player in that situation, and then you have a couple other guys on the same bye, then you do take the 0. We know that frequently in these situations, the couple of teams that advance to the playoffs do separate, but there are also lots of situations in which it ends up being very close. I believe that the roster that I had advance with Zachary Kruger last season, which I think sadly finished 4th in the first round of the playoffs and didn't get in that top 3 to advance, that team was within a handful of points. It was in that second, third range, where if we had done something slightly differently and not scored at a position during a bye week, any week along the season, that could have cost us the shot at the playoffs. And so, yeah, if you can't decide, definitely make sure you spread those buys out. Colm, we're here now, early in the 15th. Let the listeners know how things are developing.
Yeah, so to go back into it, we do have a case where Mike Gesicki ended up being auto-drafted after his large fall there. He goes at the 14-12, which that's the sort of pick that if it does turn around for Gesicki, could be a huge upside. But we obviously passed him. We're hoping that works out in our favor. Since our pick, Brevin Jordan, who we mentioned, Marlon Mack, Wendell Robinson, Jared Goff, we were hoping that we had an outside chance at going off the board there. Then we had Hayden Hurst, Zamir White, J.D. McKissick, David Njoku, KJ Hamler, one of our favorite guys. Then Daniel Jones is just after going off the board. I seen red flashing up as the color, and I was wondering, was it Mac Jones? Then we had Devontae Parker, Mike Gesicki, James Robinson, Tyrion Davis-Price, Eno Benjamin. We are seeing some interesting swings here from players and some of these running backs. Eno Benjamin, one of our favorite guys. We'll see if that works out, Shawn, for us. I've quite a heavy exposure there as well. And then Daniel Jones, who I mentioned. So at the moment, top of our queue, we have Mac Jones. Second in that queue, we have KJ Osborne. We still have Tyler Higbee in there because there's a possibility to go that way if he continued to fall back to us. Jameson Williams goes off the board. But Shawn, a lot of the options then we have in our queue are going to be some guys who potentially will be sliding down a little bit earlier. Tyler Higbee does go off the board since. So we are 4 or 5 picks away. Is Mac Jones at this point the clear pick for you at the quarterback position if he lasts? And then we talked about KJ Osborne. The one other note on this roster is at the moment we have Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, and Rashad Penny. So we will have to at some point diversify to running backs. The running backs we have in the queue, who I mentioned we will be looking at later, there is Jerick McKinnon, there's Chris Evans, there's Amir Abdullah, Samaje Perine. Ben Gretsch is getting his wish that Ty Montgomery is becoming a real life thing here, that Shawn has added him to our queue in a draft. And then we'll be looking at other later round options. But probably feel, Shawn, like a 5 running back build, or do you think we're going to push this out to 6? And is there any running backs in this range that interest you? Ronald Jones is in the ADP range.
Well, it's good to know that we've reached Ronald Jones territory. He will not be a consideration for us here, sadly. This is probably a 5 running back build, but we're going to look and see what the best values are down the stretch. We've created a lot of flexibility here. Colm, with the start that we had for tight end is actually a build that has been successful. And again, that's within the context of this contest not necessarily having 20 rounds in the past. I think that Raheem Mostert has got to be the guy here. He should probably be going at this point fairly close to the same range as Chase Edmonds. He has all of that touchdown upside. He's got the big time speed. He's a difference maker within the context of an offense where he's been successful in the past. I like the fact that there's not a lot of buzz around the running backs in this offense. It gets you a chance to get them inexpensively. The other thing we have to consider with this particular build here, though, is that we could go Mac Jones, Ryan Tannehill, and Tannehill, really probably the last draftable QB, and he seems a little bit undervalued, right? He's going to have Treylon Burks performing, you would hope, well for him at some point in the season. Robert Woods has supposedly gotten off to a good start. He brings a little bit of rushing ability. What are you thinking here in terms of balancing these two picks? It's always nice when you get to a spot in the 15-16 round and really have 3 or 4 guys you'd like to draft.
Yeah, so I think I would say we go with Mac Jones with the first pick, and then we can talk through the second pick while we're on the clock. But I'm a big fan of the Mostert pick as well. I haven't drafted a huge amount of Chase Edmonds, not because I don't like Edmonds, but Mostert and Michelle are just I think that the prices are too attractive to pass up. So I would be interested with the build we have so far of going that way. I'm not against, in terms of the quarterbacks that are left, I wouldn't be against Baker Mayfield, who we joked about earlier, although I don't feel Shawn's coming on board with that. I wouldn't be against Zach Wilson based on having Aaron Rodgers and Mac Jones. And then you already mentioned Marcus Mariota. You mentioned pairing the two of them up, but I wouldn't be against just rolling solo with Mariota and seeing how that plays out. So I'm willing to pass on Tannehill here unless you strongly want to take him.
Well, let's go with Mostert. He's one of my key running back targets in this area of the draft. Currently, he's likely to end up on the 0 RB list coming out this week. He does give us...
Shawn, we passed up. Somebody just drafted Sammy Watkins after us. Did we make a mistake taking Mostert ahead of Sammy Watkins?
Well, I know the Colm that you would like to have a full Green Bay Packers team here. I'm very proud of us. We came through with...
I can't believe how many Packers we have.
Yeah, we came through with Aaron Rodgers, Romeo Doubs, Robert Tonyan.
I think some people who probably listen to the show sometimes may be surprised that I'm actually a Packers fan due to my reluctance to want to draft them. But no, we get Mostert. Sorry for interrupting, because people have been asking me, when is the 0 RB list coming out? You've given a teaser there that Raheem Mostert may be on that list, so I'll let you continue. People are probably shouting at their phones now saying, why did you interrupt Shawn when he started to talk about that? But I'll let you take it away.
No, anytime that we can talk about a full roster of Green Bay Packers, we want to make sure we do that. The 0 RB list, it'll be out this week. This is the week I like to target with it. Have had some questions. I know a lot of drafters, the week that they do their big drafts is this, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, sometime in that time period. The articles will come out this week. I'm excited for them. We've got lots of other great content coming out. Bjorn with a really cool look at what to do after you've taken a running back, a 2 running back, 2 wide receiver start in best ball leagues. We know that that's something that will work. And if you then follow that with the right picks, and Colm, we have a running back, wide receiver start today too. So our team is one that would benefit from Bjorn's article. Lots of really cool stuff. Connor tells you how to deal with the Deshaun Watson suspension. Curtis Patrick is going to have his must draft running back. And we know that in any given year, the player that Curtis drafts the most usually goes on to having a very, very high win rate. You're going to want to have that player. Dave Cabin has put together, and Colm, I know I mentioned this on one of our other shows this week, but Dave has put together this amazing tool in the Advanced Team Stats Explorer. We talk about going into the tools and getting lost for 2-3 hours coming up, and it's the evening. This one you can come up and it'll be like a month later, right? So you're going to want to make sure that you let your family and friends know that you're going in to play with the Advanced Team Stats Explorer so that they can just plan to do other stuff, right? We're excited about this week. It's going to be an absolute blast from a fantasy football perspective. Colm, I'm loving this draft with you here. I thought maybe when we had that big wide receiver run in round 5, that things might get a little bit iffy. I think that this is, and obviously when we didn't get the 2 quarterbacks in the window, we didn't get the elite tight end. We've done some things that we don't normally do. And yet this has got to be at least, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's in a top 5 of all the drafts that I've done so far this season.
Well, that's a high expectation. Hopefully these last 4 rounds don't change your opinion. But I do think that we've done a lot of things with flexibility. Like when you're at the 112, anytime you're drafting at that back portion of you always feel like you're a little bit up against it. But a lot of things have worked out after that running back start to get the wide receivers that we got, to then get Penny. And then I think the real thing, Shawn, that turned this roster into something that I'm really excited about is the fact that when we did go Rodgers, which I wasn't sold on, then we did take Dubes, and we were thinking about taking Fant at that point. We ended up that we got Everett, Dubes, and Fant, who we thought we were kind of splitting 2 picks there to get 2 of those guys. We get all 3. Then we get Tonyan to pair with Rodgers again. Then we get Mac Jones, who we were hoping that would last back to us after we passed on Goff and Jones were our potential quarterback options there. Then we get Mostert, who you've talked about just for a short time, saying about how much he is a target for you in these late portions of the draft. So I just think a lot of things have played out for us. We obviously aren't trying to force those kind of stacks or the week 17 correlations. We're just so used now at this point also to drafting the Seahawks and the Jets that they just happen naturally in our lineups. We have got exposure to a couple of those games, and I think that sets us up pretty nicely here as we go down the home stretch. So it's going to be interesting to see how it continues to play out, Shawn. I did kind of mention when I was saying I would be happy to pass on quarterback at that last pick for Mostert, that we could potentially take some other names. The interesting thing is at this moment in time, Ryan Tannehill still has not been drafted. And interestingly enough, I mentioned the rookie tight ends and really liking them. And I mentioned Bellinger. Bellinger's actually the first rookie tight end off the board here. It goes at the 1703. So I mentioned some of the people are getting their guys here in this draft, and that has worked out for us on a couple of occasions here. But I mentioned those quarterbacks. If Tannehill comes back, I'm all in. But if Tannehill doesn't come back over this next 4 rounds, is there any other quarterbacks in that list of quarterbacks that are available from Tannehill, Wentz, Watson, Mayfield, Wilson, Mariota that you're interested in? The ones I would be truly interested in would be Mariota, Wilson, Mayfield, and Tannehill. How's that sound to you? Any of those guys of interest?
Well, Colm, what are you hearing about Sam Howell at this point, right? I mean, we know that he didn't have quite as spectacular a second preseason game, throws an interception, barely misses his former teammate De'Ami Brown on a deep shot, but he does lead another touchdown drive. He does look like their best quarterback. Obviously, I'm being silly there. What are you hearing with the Falcons? Because this Marcus Mariota versus Desmond Ridder, how late can Mariota hang on to the starting job? Can he still be around? I mean, Mariota would be gone a long time already if drafters thought that he would still be the starting quarterback in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and that has been my kind of discussion with you all along. We were doing some of these super flex drafts, and some of the other drafts we did was that I think that eventually the Falcons are not going to be in playoff contention, so they're going to want to have a look at that rookie. And that also means that do we want to play this, that we're going with Mac Jones and Aaron Rodgers throughout the main part of the season, and we're just looking for somebody who could get a spike week in the playoffs? Or are we looking for something that could give us some actionable weeks during the season? That's something that I think we're only going to really find out as the season goes on. But my feeling would be that Mariota isn't going to be the quarterback when we get to the playoffs. And at that point, then we would be relying on the way we've built this roster with the stacks for Aaron Rodgers and how that's going to play out. The other thing I was going to ask you is later, I know we were both devastated with the Taquan Thornton news over the last couple of days with his injury. With having Mac Jones, I still, if he does slide here too, is not at this pick, but in that 19th, 20th round, I would still be willing to patch him onto this roster. So in terms of the Carson Wentz goes off the board, that's always a nice pick. We weren't going to take him. But the hope here, Shawn, is that Ryan Tannehill comes to us and then we don't have to worry about what the Atlanta Falcons are going to do.
That's right. And we're 3 picks away. It still really is running back now. That's the other position. One of the things that is tricky in these drafts as you get to the 17-18 turn is that you feel like you got a lot of flexibility, and then everybody that you are looking at goes before you're up for the 19-20, and then you've got to recalibrate, right? So looking at it here, we have Chris Evans, Amir Abdullah, Samaje Perine, Ty Montgomery, all potential running back selections to add on to a roster that only has Mostert, Henry, Barkley, and Penny. Now, I think that's absolutely loaded in terms of having 4 guys and having only really spent on the first 2. But in terms of total numbers, obviously we're going to want to add at least 1 more on there. I do think these rookie tight ends in Dulcich and McBride are still very interesting. If we wanted to end up with 4 at that position,
Shawn.
Ryan Tannehill does make it.
I think that has to be the pick. I think that's worked out excellently for us. I don't think I had no hopes of that happening. He's obviously the first pick here, and then we'll talk through the second, but we have some time. We'll hold it out. You were talking about the other options. Ronald Jones still on the board, Shawn?
Ronald Jones is not going to get drafted, so...
For the listeners out there, I'm still willing to draft Ronald Jones. I think Chris Evans is probably the play for me. We have nudged on it a couple of times. We haven't really dived into it very deep, but how are you feeling on P. Ryan? The concerns that he may, put a little bit of pressure on Chris Evans here moving forward. Outside of that now, I think that Chris Evans would be my pick at this particular point of the draft.
Yeah, I think that Amir Abdullah and Ty Montgomery are probably in a better position to get touches. The question is, there's no real way for them to evolve into the role that Chris Evans might be able to manage at some point in the season. I think the flexibility that we have there might encourage us to look at Paris Campbell here, the top wide receiver available, someone who has supposedly had a good camp. We don't know that there will be a lot of volume left over after Michael Pittman is done. David Bell, still somebody that I'm drafting a lot. I do think that he's going to be the number one for the Browns, but obviously there's a huge amount of uncertainty there. Campbell, Bell, Evans, Colm, who's your pick?
I think we go Evans. I think that my hope here is that in terms of Thornton's ADP, he usually goes around about the next turn. I know I mentioned him there, Shawn. Would you be against drafting him with the concerns of the injury? It doesn't sound like he's going to be out for the season or anything like that.
It doesn't sound like he's going to be out for the season, but for a player who was probably a value kind of where he was going. I mean, you mentioned that we were frustrated. I have Thornton.
I have him everywhere.
Yeah, I have him on a huge percentage of teams because he was a clear pick in round 17 or 18. And so if you're playing in an 18-round format, then he's the clear pick at the end. If you're playing in a 28-round format like this one, then he's a clear pick at the end. He was having, by all reports, a fantastic camp within the context of an offense where they don't have a lot of talent. He was a great player to put with your Mac Jones shares. He's got the 4.2 speed to where he can get deep for a 50, 60-yard touchdown and score you a full week's worth of points on one play. I don't know. I think now that he's out, you get the 8-week time frame. A number of those weeks are going to occur right now when you're not actually losing fantasy weeks. He could still be a big-time playmaker for the end of the season, but I do think that he was such a clear pick because he's a good talent, and the chance that he would be a big part of their offense in the second half of the season made him such a clear selection. But now you kind of move the time window back for everything. And so it may be that he's just kind of getting his feet under him in weeks 16, 17, 18, that kind of thing in terms of a reality perspective. And so I think not only do you lose any kind of potential, even if it was very slight, for him to have a big role in the first month. Now it's impossible, and it pushes everything back. I would be hoping that we can find a better pick at the 19-20 turn. But if everybody we like is gone, you probably have to still consider him. Number one, I already have enough that I don't need to draft anymore while he's hurt. But I do think that this does ding his outlook quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, but I still think it can be quite positive. The other thing is, it's not ideal, especially with a rookie who misses time when they are trying to learn the offense and things like that. But there's also, for some of these players, like any player that I have drafted that the team says they are sitting out of all the preseason, I am absolutely delighted with that. That means they're going to be there in week one. There's a lot of these guys who, for example, he misses 8 weeks. That's going to be a situation where he's going to also probably miss the first 3 to 4 weeks of the season. But by week 4, by week 5, some of these guys, we don't want them to get hurt, but a Devontae Parker could have something going on. Kendrick Bourne could have something going on. That could open up opportunities then for him coming back when he's fresh and healthy. So we'll see what happens, but let's hope, Shawn. We talked about the bold predictions recently. You talked about a 70-yard touchdown at a very important point of the season. That could be week 17. But the other part of it is you mentioned Paris Campbell. He does go off the board to the drafter out of the 3 slot. We did take Chris Evans there. My thought is that a lot of the other running backs that are of high interest to me usually would be off the board by the time we get back to our pick at the 19-20 turn. I thought we would get that 5th running back to try and seal that there, because if we do look to get a rookie tight end and possibly a wide receiver, I like some of the wide receiver options better that could be there for us in those set of picks. In hindsight now that Paris Campbell has gone off the board, we didn't expect him to get back, but when we have some time to talk it through, would you rather have got Campbell there versus some of the options that might be available to us at the wide receiver position? And the second question is, are you still thinking the route of a 4th tight end in the form of one of the rookies and then a wide receiver with that last pick?
Yeah, I think especially, again, as drafters and listeners are considering the fact that you've got those 2 flex positions that the tight ends have the potential to fill out, that being heavy on tight end and having different ways you can win through the tight end is certainly a strong consideration if the other picks aren't strong. I'm sorry, say it again.
And also when we didn't get the elite tight end.
And also when we didn't get the elite tight end. That's exactly right. And so as I'm looking at it here, I do think that either Dulcich or McBride will make it through. The player I'm really hoping gets back to us is David Bell. If Bell doesn't make it back, then I definitely would have preferred to have Paris Campbell, because I think that Abdullah and Montgomery are just better bets for early season points. That's probably not a huge consideration for us if you start with Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. If you're going to win, those guys need to be scoring right off the bat. Although, again, you never know exactly what time of the season they will be injured during. We could have a Tyquan Thornton situation where sometime between now and the start of the season, one of those guys has a little bit of something come up. We don't expect to see a ton of them in preseason action between now and then, but any given day in practice, you can have a little something. So we want to maintain the flexibility. We want to draft the most total points. Colm, I'm guessing from your Chris Evans enthusiasm there that by the same token, you are not yet on the Ty Montgomery as this year's Cordero Patterson bandwagon.
Just not yet. To be honest, I have drafted him. The other player that on Ben's recommendation that I've drafted a couple of times has been Matt Breida. Hopefully we won't be winning with him on this roster because obviously we have Saquon Barkley, but the depth there is interesting. Shawn, you put a lot of pressure on me with the possibility that David Bell would go off the board. He did go off the board. So the other player who has gone off the board is Trey McBride. That there also means that Dulcich would be the only remaining rookie tight end we'd be hoping to get here. So we have 3 more people to pick before us before we get to that. David Bell has gone. Is this team now doomed?
Not doomed, but I mean, you think of the fantasy playoffs and David Bell putting up those Anquan Bolden type points. It is a blow. It is a blow. I say that again within the context of having enough David Bell that getting some diversification is definitely not a problem. Amir Abdullah goes 3 picks ahead of us there. We're 2 picks away. Colm, I think I'm looking at Dulcich and Montgomery as the 2 guys that I would love to have here. William Fuller, still not signed, at least to my knowledge, as we are recording this. Is he someone you're still drafting?
I'm still drafting him, but also starting to get more and more concerned. I had said all along, Shawn, that I thought that Jones had the better cachet in the NFL and the teams would probably want to sign him ahead of Fuller. The one thing I did do when I was over in the US, I was drafting a bunch of my own, and he goes off the board here. No, he hasn't gone off the board, actually. Drafting a lot of underdog teams. And I think in tournaments, players like Will Fuller are still very much worth the risk in terms of if he does get signed. Even if he gets signed during the season, we're talking about even that playoff run, that he could be a really strong play. So, Shawn, we do get our option here at Dulcich, so we'll take him as our first option as the tight end. And then it comes down to who we want to have here. Tyquan Thornton is still available. Shawn, Ronald Jones is still available at this particular point of the draft. You have said we're not drafting him. But who do you prefer? I took Evans, and obviously we did not get the Bell pick back to us. Who would you prefer to take here? I'll let you take the second pick.
So you're locked in on Dulcich with the first one,
unless you don't want him, but I think we should take him.
Okay. So we'll take Dulcich there. Yeah, Fuller is pretty intriguing. It is interesting to hear you say that you're willing to draft the guys who may miss a big chunk of time. Well, but again, we wouldn't really expect them to contribute early. And I mean, obviously you're comparing them to players who probably don't have a ton of value either.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. The upside of the likes of a Fuller or even a Thornton, like we have at this point, we have 7 wide receivers ahead of them. So if this pick doesn't work out, I think we're really going for all out upside at this point. So I'm happy to go Montgomery either, but I think we have our 5 running backs. I'll let you though. You can make the pick. I messed up on the Evans pick.
No. I think that I'm leaning toward Montgomery here, but let me ask you, we've got 8 seconds. Any thoughts on Nelson Aguilar, who is trendy in camp? Okay, so no. See, it only takes 5 seconds is plenty to get the up down on Nelson Aguilar. One of the reasons I ask that is because obviously we do have Mac Jones, and so you're thinking week 17.
We also now have Matt Jones wide receiver 1 though, and Ty Montgomery. This is Galaxy Brandon of the highest order.
The issue here, obviously, is that to have that Cordero Patterson season, and obviously you're not going to have the Cordero Patterson season again, which is one of the reasons why we don't. Yeah, we don't have a bunch of articles on who the next Cordero Patterson is going to be because there isn't going to be one. You needed to have a situation where you have this elite athlete, this hybrid talent that a lot of coaches in the past have not used properly, and is in an offense that has nobody else there. And perhaps the strangest thing about Ty Montgomery's emergence over the last month is that they have Damian Harris and they have Ramondre Stevenson. And obviously this is kind of gone by the wayside, but they have Pierre Strong, right? And so Montgomery has more or less sidelined him, and yet to move into any type of Patterson role, he would need, well, probably what you would need is a Damian Harris trade. There have been rumors to that effect, but I think mostly it's just, kind of thinking it through that maybe it would make sense if they're so high on these other guys. No real reason to believe that they would let Harris depart this season unless someone wanted to overpay. But you would almost need a trade and then an injury, or perhaps just one injury, right? In these backfields, you can have that kind of thing. One of the reasons that so many of the 49ers are always interesting to drafters is that somehow their backs score a ton of points, but always get hurt. So Ty Montgomery doesn't really have a path to the type of volume that you would need, at least not immediately. And we're going to have a different offense. This isn't going to be the Josh McDaniels offense that has really funneled passes to that running back position, created extremely positive fantasy seasons for James White on multiple occasions. However, we do still think that the offense is going to develop into something that works. Maybe that won't be week 1, week 2, but Mac Jones, one of the reasons that we are drafting him is that the second-year breakout will probably happen at some point. He was simply too good of a prospect and had too good of a rookie season to not come through. I say that. I mean, obviously there are scenarios in which he would not come through, but the price that you're getting on the upside outcomes is very, very encouraging. Within that context, it makes sense then to also bet a little bit on that offense, to bet on a Ty Montgomery. There aren't a lot of great ways to play it. I do think that Nelson Aguilar in round 20 is actually a good pick at this point. He's not the most exciting pick, so I did get the instantaneous thumbs down from Colm. But Colm, we're at the end here. There are 3 picks to go, some of the last round picks for folks. We did get the Boston Scott and Matt Breida selections. We're getting Dontrell Hilliard, a back who I think is good, and is probably going to play some this year, but when you consider the couple guys behind him, I don't know how he would actually come through and score any points. We are getting some final round picks of Donald Parham and Kyle Rudolph. Rudolph, an interesting dart throw, I think, in that Buccaneers offense. And we can't go to the wrap before we say that the two picks immediately before us at the 1920 turn were two of our favorites, Chuba Hubbard and Laviska Shenault. Colm, I am surprised that they're being drafted in 2022, but I wish them the best of luck.
I certainly wish them the best of luck, particularly Laviska Shenault, who I have sprinkled into a couple of rosters, Shawn, but those couple of picks from Chris Evans through to Ty Montgomery, you mentioned that you give me the possibility, of drafting Nelson Aguilar. You also give me that possibility with 8 seconds left on the clock, so it had to be a quick yes or no answer. But we do finish up with Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, DJ Moore, Mike Williams, DK Metcalf, Elijah Moore, Brandon Ayuk, Devontae Smith, Rashad Penny, Aaron Rodgers, Gerald Everett, Romeo Doubs, Noah Fant, Robert Tonyan. Then we have Mac Jones, Raheem Mostert, Ryan Tannehill, Chris Evans, Greg Dulcich, and Ty Montgomery to wind things up. So we have 7 wide receivers. We have 5 running backs. Then we have our 4 tight ends, 3 quarterbacks. I think it's really well balanced. I think this team is absolutely loaded. So the draft is about to close out. We will be back with a recap show. Make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get that once it is released. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. And if you are signing up for a RotoViz NFL Pass, where you get access to all of our content and tools, you can do so at rotoviz.com, and you can use the promo code RVRadio2022 while signing up to get yourself a 10% discount. Until we're back with another show, have a good one.